So the news came out a few weeks ago that Robert Eggers is making a werewolf movie, and as soon as I saw the announcement, I started laughing because it's called Werewolf, but the title is spelled W-E-R-W-U-L-F. And one of the only pieces of information we have is that it's performed in period-accurate 13th century British dialogue. Get it? Werewolf! I can already taste the Ralph Ineson. One of the things I really respect about Robert Eggers as an artist is the way he creates something so different with each new project he takes on. I mean, there are various hallmarks and stylistic signatures through which you can tell you're watching a Robert Eggers film, like a certain commitment to atmosphere or how they all end on weird nudity, but every one of his movies says something very different and in a different way than all of the others, constantly experimenting with tone and with style in a way that almost feels self-challenging. And one of the most under-discussed elements of Eggers' work is his sense of humor. His films are creepy and esoteric and thoughtful, we all know that, but they're also funny in a way that nobody ever really talks about. Now, would I describe Robert Eggers as a director of comedies? No, but if we're going to be applying strict genre labels, humor really isn't as far from horror on the grand spectrum as you might imagine. Think about how much comedy is reliant on tragedy or schadenfreude or social transgression. Horror and comedy have always been the two genres most equipped at challenging generational taboos, and I think that's because of the way each takes us outside of our mental comfort zone. That's one of the things the Terrifier franchise really has going for it, this almost meditative exploration of the overlap between horror, comedy, and fantasy, and how we consume them all as a society. The conversation around those movies tends to focus on all the gore and violence or the use of practical effects, but they actually have quite a bit to say for themselves and undercut a lot of slasher tropes in some really interesting ways. Though they are definitely not for the faint of, stomach. I didn't get the chance to see Nosferatu when it was in theaters. I'm very broke, please give me money. But I've had this general topic on my mind since the movie first came out. Because while I was doing my best to avoid spoilers, it really is impossible to be on social media and not see people's reactions to a popular movie. And a really common one I remember seeing among, cinephile circles was a frustration with theater audiences for laughing during what was referred to as the possession scene. So right off the bat, I knew I was going to be in for something crazy. Ha! Get it? Bat? No, but part of me was glad I missed out on that because I really have just absolutely no tolerance for people who are disruptive in movie theaters. But I also started wondering, even then, what the actual tone of this movie was going to be. None of Eggers' films are entirely straightforward, and I think of something like The Lighthouse, which is very dark and also very silly.
You sound like a goddamn parody.
Or The Northman, which is not a silly movie, but very much a satirical one nonetheless, and one which is at least possessed of a sense of humor. I typically describe The Northman to people as like the more obvious version of 300. Is it still controversial to say that Zack Snyder is a satirist, by the way? It's been like 2 years, man. I don't know what's going on anymore. But The Northman is something you can enjoy as a straightforward, revenge-themed action film, and then also, if you read between the lines, there are certain elements which make it clear the film is also satirizing revenge and masculinity for those who are paying attention. And I think there's so much artistry in crafting a story that can strike multiple tones this way without being disrespectful or disingenuous to the spirit of either. When I initially got wind of the Nosferatu laughter discourse, what it first reminded me of was the way some people reacted to the orgy scene in Midsommar, and then how some other people reacted to those reactions. Midsommar was one of the first films I covered on this channel, and I made that video almost specifically because, at the time, I felt the tone of the movie was being widely misrepresented. To me, the big sex scene near the end of the film is pretty blatantly meant to be awkward and a little funny. The look on Christian's face when the old lady comes up behind him and starts pushing on his butt is clearly played for laughs, and so is this moment of post-nut clarity he has right after finishing where he looks around and suddenly realizes he's in a horror movie. There was some real negativity about people laughing during this whole sequence when Midsommar was in theaters, and I do get why. I have legit stopped talking to people for being obnoxious in movies, besides which the scene does also turn into a sexual assault. But I don't think laughter is necessarily the wrong reaction to have here either. This was kind of an obnoxious expression even back in 2019, but for lack of a better term, I think there is a certain type of elevated horror fan who tends towards the self-serious in a way that actually overlooks some of the nuance and artistry in the work of filmmakers like Ari Aster or Robert Eggers. If you want to see a movie showcasing both Aster's sense of humor and his respect for trauma, you should check out his short film, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons. If you haven't seen it yet and want to, I would honestly recommend doing so before watching the next few minutes of this video, because a lot of the charm comes from experiencing certain reveals. The movie is about a father being sexually abused by his son over the course of many years, which is something that does happen, parents being abused by their children in this way, though usually when they're much older, and the film treats this very horrific situation with all of the gravity that it's due. But because the reality of sexual abuse between a parent and their child is so often the other way around, there is an element of absurdism in the dynamic being reversed on film, which the movie clearly plays off of. The scene that always gets me is just after the 7-minute mark, where the camera comes in on the father, Sidney's bookshelf, and we see these 3 books of poetry that he's published. And just looking at the covers, you can see the time when the abuse started and how it set the whole rest of his life out of tone. And this is the film's trick. It uses humor to lull you into a false sense of levity, if not security, so it can hit you that much harder with these brutal, almost viciously authentic depictions of the way this kind of abuse is ignored or covered up within family units. Getting to Nosferatu, this is the movie Eggers has wanted to direct his entire career, and in many ways it feels like his most straightforward, accessible film to date. He's been putting on amateur and professional stage productions of Nosferatu since high school, and talked about making this particular adaptation for more than a decade before he started writing the script. Apparently, there's a 40,000-word novella containing Orlok's backstory that Eggers wrote just for Bill Skarsgård, and which he's forbidden him from divulging the details of publicly. So if I had to pick one of his movies from the onset to stand out from the others as a likely passion project, the place for Eggers to really spread his leathery bat wings and fly, this would probably be it. And Nosferatu does not disappoint. The acting was amazing. Bill Skarsgård and Lily Rose Depp both just blew me away. Willem Dafoe was great, so was Aaron Taylor-Johnson. Like everything Eggers makes, it's an absolute masterwork of atmosphere. You can practically taste the fog and piss vapor of old London.
There is no fog in London. There is no London fog.
Are you sure about that?
Quite. Never was. It was the coal dust from the industrial era. Charles Dickens and whatnot.
I cannot say enough about how good this movie looks. And sounds! The stuff they're doing with Bill Skarsgård's voice is wild. He worked with an opera singer to get to the right octave and memorized some of his lines in a dead language. Then he has this booming omnipresence after the effects work that almost feels like the antipode of Max Schreck's silent original. People often describe Murnau's Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, as Dracula with the serial numbers filed off. And it is true, the film was written as an adaptation of Stoker's novel, with most of the names and locations changed to account for German audiences, and supposedly as an attempt to avoid copyright infringement. Count Orlok is Count Dracula, Ellen Hutter is Mina Harker, von Franz, named Bulwer in the original, is Van Helsing, and so on. But I think Murnau's film is actually much more subversive of the source material than people will often credit. The way the film gives Ellen/Mina a more prominent role, for example, actually being the one to vanquish the Count at the cost of her own life rather than being saved from vampirism by Jonathan Harker and his merry men. Dracula is a wonderfully Irish novel in that it is both highly class-conscious and highly xenophobic. The latter element has become less prominent over the years, as the cultural anxieties being reflected in the story have... well, I can't really say they've faded, they haven't at all, but the face of them has changed. You know, people really aren't worried so much anymore about those disgusting backwards Eastern Europeans coming to corrupt good English women with their eyes and their fluids. Murnau's adaptation seems to accentuate these features, I think deliberately, with the addition of plot elements like a plague and a swarm of rats, both of which were negatively associated at the time with immigrants. And then there's Orlok himself, who does not look at all like Count Dracula or even a human being. He looks, in fact, precisely like the sort of caricature used at the time to demonize predominantly Jewish immigrants out of Eastern Europe. Some have accused Murnau of anti-Semitism over this and the rat thing, but two elements of the film in particular make me think he was actually being deliberately ironic about the novel. First is the detail that sunlight kills the vampire. That was not part of the original story, and I think you can figure out the proposed symbolism yourself. But even more significant is the change in setting. Dracula was a contemporary novel for the time it was published. The Todd Browning film also took place the same year it was released, and most adaptations of the story have retained that time period, near the turn of the 20th century. But Nosferatu takes place in 1838, almost 100 years earlier. And instead of coming from London, Thomas Hutter is dispatched to Transylvania from the fictional town of Wisburg, Germany. The German location isn't particularly surprising. Murnau was a German filmmaker, but the period change? That is much more significant because the clash of modernity versus old world mysticism is a major theme in Dracula, and the setting is not irrelevant to that. Now, Germany, which is to say the modern German state as we know it today, did not actually exist in 1838, but you could say that the idea was beginning to emerge. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806 by Napoleon, whose own empire fell apart very shortly after that. And in the following years, Germany was really a loose confederation of small kingdoms, tribes, and principalities that didn't even start to form a unified national identity until the revolutions of 1848, 10 years after the events of the film. Setting his story just before the German revolutions of the 19th century feels like a deliberate choice on Murnau's part because the film was being made just a few years after the first German revolutions of the 20th century. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the history of the Weimar Republic, but let's just say that nationalism was in the air. To put things into perspective, just a year after Nosferatu came out, Adolf Hitler staged a coup out of a Munich beer hall and tried to take over the government. They stopped him, thank God, but that should give you an idea as to what the political environment in Germany was like at the time. There's not a lot of hard information about what Murnau's personal politics might have been. He was openly gay and moved from Germany to America in the mid-1920s when things started to turn over. Some of the people he associated with did turn out to be Nazis, while others were the exact opposite. Ultimately though, whether Murnau was being sarcastic about the novel or expressing genuine xenophobia with the changes he made, my point is the same, that even the original Nosferatu was not entirely straightforward in tone. Egger's film is very dark and creepy and as atmospherically intense as anything he's ever made, alongside all of which I do detect a vein of, if not humor, then at least humorous self-awareness. Some of it may just be the typical sense of reflective irony that accompanies any period piece made for a 21st century audience.
I'm disposed to recommend that she sleep in her corset. It encourages correct posture, calms the womb, and revives circulation.
But there are also some choices made by the film that, as an editor especially, really do strike me with deliberate humor. You take this scene where Orlok enters Thomas's room to drink his blood, which is very spooky and intense and was clearly put together with a lot of artistry, and it leads into a really trippy sequence where Orlok and Thomas are floating up into the air, intercut with images of Ellen bleeding and slow falling out of a window. And then it just really abruptly cuts to this. Something about the way his leg is cocked while the camera just rests on this sucking movement, it just feels very bereft of dignity in a way that seems to deliberately contrast with the montage that led into it. Especially because the music completely drops, so you just hear this slurping sound like he's draining a milkshake. I think there's often an element of cheekiness to this scene where the male protagonist meets the Count.
I never drink. Why?
And Thomas being so out of sorts here does have a certain energy I find vaguely comedic. I might just be reading it that way because he's being played by Nicholas Hoult right after he was in Renfield, but that too feels like it might have been a deliberate choice, kind of like Lars von Trier's use of Bruno Ganz in The House That Jack Built. A lot of the moments I found funny are side by side with, or even right in the middle of some of the darkest, most carefully crafted sequences in the film. If Nosferatu does have a sense of humor, it's subtle, and one which enriches and bolsters the primary narrative rather than undermining or ridiculing it. So, was the possession scene funny? Well, it was definitely uncomfortable, and I think a lot of humor is based in discomfiture, as well as a lot of fear. It is also very sexual. and I think a lot of people, especially when they're young, have the tendency to laugh at depictions of taboo or boundary-crossing behavior because they're shocked, but that doesn't necessarily make what they're reacting to funny. Everything else aside, Lily Rose Depp was insanely impressive in this scene. The shaking, the facial contortions, the stuff she was doing with her tongue, which is probably going to wind up as the thumbnail of this video, just jaw-dropping stuff. In terms of tone, what I think I most want to compare it to is that scene in The Lighthouse where Willem Dafoe's character spends a full 2 minutes cursing Robert Pattinson's character for refusing to compliment his lobster. While he's pouring it out, we see old Tom go from angry to righteous to sad to almost remorseful as the implications of what he's willing on young Tom sink in. It's a very powerful scene, and also creepy and ludicrous and serious and funny and also curiously sexual.
Smother this young mouth with pungent slime, to choke ye, engorging your organs till ye turn blue and bloated with bilge and brine and can scream no more.
And while I don't think the scene from Nosferatu is meant to be quite as overtly comedic as that, I do also think Robert Eggers is too self-aware a filmmaker not to know how people are going to take it when Lily Rose Depp says, "I'll be good," before she crawls up to Nicholas Hoult, starts nuzzling his bulge, then tells him he's not man enough to dick her down right there with God and Orlok watching. But that doesn't undercut the overall seriousness of the scene. I think the title of werewolf is probably a partial joke, but that doesn't diminish, nor is it diminished by the other piece of information we have about the movie, which is that it's the darkest thing Eggers has written so far. You know, many of Shakespeare's plays, even the ones we think of as very serious in tone, were considered much funnier by audiences in their own time. A lot of this is because the way people respond to things like puns and general wordplay has kind of shifted over the years, but it highlights something else that I think is worth pointing out about horror and comedy, which is that while there are some things that are timelessly scary and timelessly funny, like death and babies, as art forms, I find them to be the two genres most of their times, so to speak. Horror and comedy have always occupied a unique, often underappreciated place within the zeitgeist. These are the genres which frequently have the most to say, for all they're snubbed by critics and industry awards, and while they might not be entwined, they do share some connecting tissue. The first laugh most of us experience comes on the heels of fear when we're a baby and our mother plays the peekaboo game with us. And then, when we get a little bit older, we discover how funny it can be to jump out of a hiding place and scare someone else. Think about all the prank videos or comedic reality shows that are essentially just scaring the shit out of people in a controlled setting. And doesn't it seem like most horror franchises turn more and more comedic the longer they go on for? The presence of humor in a film does not diminish the more serious elements of the piece, nor its overall impactfulness or value as a work of art. The decades and centuries roll by and sensibilities change from one generation to the next, and now people don't necessarily laugh in the same way at the same moments in Shakespeare's plays. But the strength of his work, which touches so deeply upon every human emotion, is undiminished. The final shot of the film, with Ellen lying beneath Orlok's body and the flowers all around them, it actually reminded me of that William Faulkner short, A Rose for Emily. The story is about a woman who so stubbornly refuses to adapt to life's changes that she goes to bed every night with the corpse of her ex-lover. First published in 1930, A Rose for Emily has been widely interpreted as an expression of Faulkner's frustrations with his native South, likening the former Confederate States' refusal to enter the 20th century with a demented old woman going to sleep every night next to a dead body because she can't move on. Eggers has given interviews where he bemoans the loss of a certain scariness in modern vampire films, tethered as they are to generations of cinematic tradition. And while his film pays homage, here and there, to the various adaptations, by and large, Eggers' Nosferatu ignores most of the classic vampire tropes, drawing its inspiration more from the vampires of Slavic folklore that people actually believed in. Count Orlok planting his flag somewhere between a walking corpse, a spirit, and a sorcerer. To which end, I think the final shot is evoking Faulkner to comment on a kind of stagnation that Eggers sees in modern vampire films. Tropes are one of the things that move a story along, that help us define what kind of story it is we're taking in, but they can be oppressive too, stifling. They can make a narrative predictable, and really, who wants a predictable horror movie?
And lo, the maiden fair did offer up her love unto the beast. and with him lay in close embrace until the first cockcrow. Her willing sacrifice thus broke the curse and freed them from the plague of Nosferatu.
When a trope or an archetype or a popular cinematic motif is overturned, it's because someone made something groundbreaking and new that took things in a different direction. And often this will be so memorable, will make such an impression on audiences and future artists that it will itself inspire imitators, and then a new trope is born. Robert Eggers is part of this whole generation of filmmakers, along with Ari Aster, Jennifer Kent, Jordan Peele, maybe Ty West, but definitely David Robert Mitchell, who've breathed a whole new kind of life into mainstream commercial horror over the last 10 years or so, with films that are thoughtful and esoteric and unapologetically presented to the audience as something between a puzzle and a Rorschach test. Part of me is tempted to call it a renaissance, but that really wouldn't be honest. Horror has always been weird and thoughtful and esoteric, which is why I think that phrase, elevated horror, rubbed so many fans the wrong way, because it's really not horror that's being elevated by this new wave so much as the popular perception of horror by mainstream audiences. So maybe elevating horror would be a better label? The reason I'm not sure about including Ty West is not due to a lack of admiration for his work, by the way. I actually enjoyed Pearl quite a bit. It's just that the Maxine trilogy never really feels all that much like it's trying to scare you. I'd honestly compare it more to something deconstructive and comedic that comments on horror, like Cabin in the Woods, but with a little more humanity. Is there a place where schlock becomes indistinguishable from absurdism or surrealism? Is the distinction between trash and high art more than just one of perception? Bookstores and streaming algorithms want us to believe that genres are separated like oil and water. Here one, there the other, and nowhere do they mix. But I find it more helpful to think of it like the separation of smoke and air, swirling and mixing together, boundaries changing as they dissolve and reform, always twisting into new shapes. The Witch was a very dark film satirizing religious mania, and it does so with a lot of empathy and tragedy and horror, but there is also a very grim element of humor in a how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb kind of way.
Did ye make some unholy bond with that ghost?
Art can be serious and satirical, scary and funny, just like life, just like people. And I think we may be doing ourselves a disservice, missing out on the full flavor profile, so to speak, when we lock ourselves into a single idea for what the tone of a movie is going to be, what it should be, especially with deep, psychologically complex films like the ones Robert Eggers makes. The possession sequence is one of the most intense scenes in the movie. It was the first thing Eggers had Lily Rose Depp perform when she auditioned for the part, along with that scene from the beginning where she recounts her nightmare to Thomas, which I also felt had a subtle mixture of tone, by the way. You know, she's describing some very disturbing things and she conveys so much horror with her expression. But then Thomas's face is also in the shot and he's horrified too, but for a different reason, and the first thing he says is like, "Holy shit, please do not repeat that to anyone ever again." There is a little bit of humor there, but the scene isn't a joke at all, and it foreshadows some very important things about the climax of the film. It's funny in the way that S. Craig Zahler can be funny. There is something both very silly and very scary about delving into the human id, exploring the implications of those desires and anxieties that dwell in the deepest part of our psyche. And when you go deep enough, I think a lot of these boundary lines we apply to the artistic expression of those feelings start to break down. Humor is very, very close to catharsis. And what is catharsis if not the cessation of fear? It's like we experience hot and cold as two different sensations. But scientifically speaking, we know there's no such thing as cold. There are just different degrees of heat and the theoretical absence of heat. But when we lose heat from our bodies, we experience that as a unique sensation, and we call it cold. And I know we can't measure human emotions in the same way we do something like temperature. We don't even know if they're real in the same way, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn that humor had a similar relationship to, if not fear, then anxiety. When someone slips on a banana peel or steps on a rake, we're seeing a person hurt themselves, but when put into a comedy skit, people found it amusing. Trauma can be funny from a distance, gallows humor and all that. These emotions live close to each other in our heads, and I don't think acknowledging the inherent comedy of a particularly crafted situation represents a lack of appreciation for the art. Quite the contrary. You know, being trapped beneath these preconceived notions of what your reaction to a film should be, based essentially off how it's marketed, that too can be stifling. Robert Eggers' films are dark and deep and very complex, and while only 3 of the 4 can earnestly be described as horror movies, they all contain elements of humor. These are movies that are meant to be rewatched and unpacked, and if your genuine response is to find something funny, even in a very serious scene, you're not necessarily having the wrong reaction. Just, you know, try to shut up in movie theaters, and if you have to laugh, don't cackle at the top of your voice like a butt-fucked hyena because people paid money to be there and you might be ruining their evening. Well, it has been a minute since my last proper upload, hasn't it? I guess it depends on whether or not I get this up before this penguin thing. I haven't gone anywhere, there's just been a lot going on that's occupied my time, not the least of which being this one very long video I've been working on almost exclusively for over a year now. It's still a good way from finished, but we are getting there, and I think a lot of you are going to be pleased with the subject. I'm also in the middle of an interstate move at the moment, which I've already had to postpone once due to some car troubles that are still being sorted out, so I really do appreciate your patience, and far more importantly, your money! As such, thank you especially to my patrons. I do plan on uploading much more frequently this year, so hopefully I'll have some more content out for you real soon.
Wise in measure should each man be, yet wise enough to be the fool.
Wise enough to be the fool.